When you hear the word anarchy, what comes to mind? Maybe it sounds juvenile, unrealistic, or chaotic even. You know, the crude circle A spray painted on a wall somewhere, punks with spiked jackets, anarchy in the UK. A rejection of order, descent into violence, chaos, an image of something wild and ungoverned. These are the associations most of us are given. The shorthand that we inherit with this word anarchy, certainly the ones that I have and had. And yet, once you start engaging with the history of anarchistic thought and action, it's remarkable how simple and how, I think, deeply appealing the stance of anarchy and anarchism actually is. Anarchism, at its core, is a skepticism of power. Not just of government, but of any system or structure that consolidates power over people and seeks to entrench itself as permanent, whether that's economic or social or otherwise. It doesn't argue for chaos, but rather for radical, maybe decentralization, mutual aid, self-governance. And in my learning about it, which I'm really doing now live, about the history and its really diverse conversations, I'm finding it really kind of playful and open-ended and inventive. And at its very base, optimistic and humanistic. And there'll be more on that in just a minute. Because I think we are, perhaps unknowingly, entering a period of renewed interest in anarchistic thought. Because whatever your ideological leanings, it's hard to ignore the ways in which our governing structures, our economic forces, our social hierarchies are failing. They fail morally, they fail practically, and they're starting to fail in providing even the most basic security and predictability, the things which probably have kept them afloat in our minds for centuries the most. And those failures are mounting. People are starting, I think, to look for alternatives, or may find themselves open to previously ignored conversation spaces. So in this spirit, I've had two conversations about anarchy that I'm going to share this week. One is with Ruth Kinna, that's this one. She's a historian of anarchistic thought and explores the long intellectual tradition behind anarchism, how it has been theorized, challenged, and put into practice. You'll get some of the important names and philosophers and angles that you should know in this conversation, and hear how some of those ideas may be manifested in different times. And then the other conversation I had is with Sophie Scott Brown, who's also a historian, but also is a bit more of a political philosopher. And that discussion focuses more on how anarchism is operating in the world today, or could soon be. How it's engaging with real world problems and maybe opening up new possibilities. And as I explore these conversations, I'm also writing an essay on what I'm calling the fatal flaws of libertarianism. And I'll be careful with that word, because at least the version of libertarianism I'm referring to there is the one that has come to sort of dominate American discourse of what libertarianism is. Because the word libertarian has a complicated history. In much of Europe and in anarchistic traditions, it was once closely linked with the skepticism of power in any form, actually in spirit sort of used interchangeably with the word anarchy. So antagonistic towards governmental or corporate or other forms of power. But in the US, it's sort of been largely co-opted by a almost reverence for unfettered capitalism, the kind maybe championed by Milton Friedman and others, where the market is treated as a kind of natural, self-correcting force. Anyway, that's a major shift in this word libertarian, so I'll try to be careful about it, and one worth investigating, especially if we're talking about systems of power and what it means to be free. But before we get into that in the conversations, I want to start by pointing at a figure whose influence, I think, looms over all of us, whether we know it or not. And it's this guy. It's Thomas Hobbes. Whether or not you recognize the name, I suspect that you're familiar with his ideas, because we've all, in some ways, been shaped by them. Hobbes's vision of human nature, which he laid out famously in the Leviathan, has come to dominate political thought really for centuries since he's written it. His famous claim that in a state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short is a grim, sort of transactional view of humanity. To him, people are fundamentally self-interested, locked in competition, constantly threatening one another. And so the only way to escape this condition and this awful situation that he described in nature, he argued, is to submit to a sovereign power, a total sovereign power, to construct a state that's strong enough to impose order, to force cooperation, maybe to prevent and tamp down all these forces in us, to prevent the war of all against all, as he said. And yet this vision of human nature isn't just an abstract political theory. It has underpinned much of what we call progress. And I don't want to scoff at that. The idea that we advance through competitive suspicion of the other, through self-interest pushing us towards innovation and dominance, has fueled economic and political systems for centuries. Enlightenment thinkers often hitched their aspirations to this foundation, embracing the notion that individual ambition and competition drive civilization forward, whatever that means. And you see the echoes of it in figures like Ayn Rand, of course, and the arguments of Steven Pinker, and even in pop culture, like films like Wall Street, where Michael Douglas, his character famously declares greed is good, or at least it's on the posters. His full speech was a little different, but greed is good, Wall Street. And to its credit, by the way, the film presents him and his character as a complex kind of anti-hero rather than purely glorifying him outright. Perhaps in that same spirit, there's films like American Psycho or The Wolf of Wall Street, both of which tap into this cultural narrative of sort of the ruthless, hyper-individualistic, capitalist man as a kind of inevitable force of nature. Maybe even There Will Be Blood is in that vein as well. And I think sometimes it's difficult for some viewers to notice the subtle critique in these cautionary tales, especially now in the Donald Trump or Elon Musk worshipping moment that we're in. But my question about something like the poster for Wall Street, perhaps an anarchistic question, is this one. Okay, greed is good. Well, greed does good. Sure, maybe we could talk about that. But is greed good? If we accept a Hobbesian view of man, we may well find ourselves locked in a kind of competitive technological arms race fueled by status seeking or material seeking or money seeking or whatever, which does produce sometimes an undeniable form of technological progress. But at what cost? Are these advances built on a world where we live in a mental fortress, eyeing everyone around us as potential threats behind their polite smiles? And of course, there's nothing in this competitive theory of man which then guarantees any kind of fair distribution of the forms of technological progress which it might uncover. This is why it seems that all forms of technological progress seem to result in simply squeezing more labor and work out of people rather than liberating them. And, of course, the bigger question maybe is, how real is the Hobbesian theory of man anyway? How accurate and true is that? It's no coincidence that Lord of the Flies is a book that's taught in schools all over America. I think I had to read it in 3rd grade. I assume it's still being taught in schools. The novel, of course, for the refresher, written by William Golding in 1954, tells the story of a British schoolboys, I believe they were all boys, who were stranded on an uninhabited island after a plane crash, and then left to their own devices, their initial attempts at order quickly dissolve into violence and hierarchy and savagery, culminating in outright murder. The story, I think, is a not so subtle warning, right? Without structure, without authority, without rules, without Leviathan, human nature will unravel back into its natural state of brutality and domination. But as historian Rutger Bregman has pointed out, the novel is pure fiction. In fact, a real-life incident presents strikingly different results. In 1965, 6 Tongan schoolboys were stranded on a deserted island called Atta, for over a year after running away from their boarding school, ironically enough. And instead of descending into chaos, they cooperated, built a garden, set up a communal food system, and took turns keeping watch for passing ships. When they were finally rescued, they were found in good health, having survived through mutual aid and collective effort. I mean, does it always go like that? I have no idea. But the point is, Lord of the Flies is not some kind of universal truism. And modern culture loves reinforcing this Hobbesian view. I mean, look at Survivor and the flood of copycat reality TV shows where deception, backstabbing, and self-interest are the winning strategies. I think the name of it, Survivor, tells you a lot. The people who are best at all those kinds of conniving strategies and fake smiles or whatever are rewarded, actually, and celebrated. And it's no surprise that when these shows became popular, they spawned all the copycats. And every reality competition show, from Big Brother to The Apprentice, Mr. Donald Trump, to The Bachelor and so on, they play on the same assumption that people are fundamentally selfish, status-seeking, and ready to manipulate one another for personal gain. These shows don't just reflect a cynical worldview, they help shape and reinforce it, subtly nudging us to accept that this is just how people are. I mean, it's quite natural, those shows, to view in a capitalist society especially. And yet, it's crucial to remember these are game shows. They're not reality shows. As a documentary filmmaker, obviously that word reality really irks me, but these are game shows, not reality shows. And they're artificially structured, designed for maximum conflict, edited for drama, which is injected by producers, and built around the premise that if you pit people against one another, betrayal and cutthroat tactics will emerge. But that's the story the game is telling, not necessarily the truth about human nature. The real trick is that we don't just watch these shows or movies or books or philosophical arguments, which really are hard to distinguish maybe from the news outlets today. We kind of internalize them. We apply their logic to workplaces, relationships, even political and economic systems, as if the world itself were some vast competition game show where trust and cooperation are naive liabilities and illusions, just merely masking our selfish natures. And it's not how you win anyway. And so anarchism, at its core, challenges the game itself. It dares to ask whether these structures, these assumptions, are real at all, or if we've simply been taught or groomed to play along. It questions whether Hobbes was ever right, whether we need, let alone desire, the Leviathan in any form. And so, as I'm discovering, there is a rich history and tradition of thinkers and doers and poets and authors and storytellers who go well beyond the, safety pin wearing punk rockers, though I only have love for them, that have always rejected this Hobbesian story. And that tension, the tension between the Hobbesian argument for the necessity of control and submission, and the rejection of that, and the anarchistic possibility that no leviathans, or perhaps no permanent leviathans, are necessary or desirable, is exactly what I want to explore in these next two conversations about anarchy. So, let's begin. I'm going to start with a conversation focused a little bit more on history with Ruth Kinna. And then the next conversation will bring us more into the present and future with Sophie Scott Brown. And then I have my own essay that's going to challenge, I think, some of the, how Americans at least have come to use the word libertarian, the fatal flaws in capitalist libertarianism. And so let's see if by the end of this, what maybe once seemed juvenile or silly or violently radical with this word anarchy doesn't start to maybe feel instead deeply humane and perhaps appealing. So, okay, enjoy my little investigation into anarchy and anarchism. Hey, so I actually just finished recording with Ruth, and it was kind of amazing, but pretty long. We really took on a lot of history. So this is part one, as you could see from the title. I'm going to release it in two parts. So this one pretty much picks up the history starting around Hobbes and the post-Hobbesian period of anarchist thought with Proudhon, who you meet, kind of starts the ball rolling with thought and history. And this is going to take us kind of all the way to around World War One. And then the second part is going to take sort of World War One and bring us through the punk movement when anarchy gets a little revival, kind of all the way to today and where we are. So enjoy. This is part one of the conversation on anarchy. Thanks. Let's start, because this is going to be the first sort of question for my audience is, what are the misconceptions about anarchy? Like, what should people with their first foot in the door kind of, pop the balloons of what they think anarchy is? Can you just give me that sort of, leave this stuff at the door? That's not right. Yeah.
I mean, even that one is quite hard because there are so many misconceptions.
Right.
But I think the one that Proudhon, who's sometimes regarded as one of the key thinkers of the anarchist tradition, where he starts is the prejudice for leadership.
Okay.
So the idea, so he says that the bias against anarchy is a bias which is underpinned by the belief that we cannot do anything unless we are told to do so, or unless we have some kind of instruction or someone who is better than us in some way giving us guidance. So that's the sort of starting point, that we can't do things by ourselves.
Yeah.
And then I think there are other. I mean, that's the root of the chaos problem. Mm-hmm. And then there are other historically rooted prejudices. The notable one being that anarchism is about bomb throwing and violence.
Yeah.
And that's also deeply, deeply rooted. And, it has some, like all of these biases, I suppose, there is some basis for it in history. But actually, the reputation that anarchism has for violence precedes the violence that any anarchists actually engaged in. So,
yeah.
And the final one, I would say, the final one, which is quite a prevalent one, is the sort of the mirror image of those two things, which is, it's a great idea, isn't it? A lovely idea, but we all have to be extremely good, and it's utopian and impossible.
Right. So what is, simply then, maybe what is anarchy not? Like, anarchy is not a system of chaos. Anarchy is not survival of the fittest. Like, what do you want to say anarchy is not, before we start talking about what anarchy might be, or historically, if we could pin that, what is it not?
That's a really good starting point, actually. So I would say, I'm very much attracted to Kropotkin's thoughts. So Kropotkin is another 19th, early 20th century thinker, and he says anarchy is not competition, and which links to the idea of social Darwinism and his rejection of social Darwinism, the idea that we're locked in this eternal sort of struggle. But he takes from that anarchy is not about it's not about individual competition. It's about collaboration.
Yeah, that's quite good. Well, then let's start. So I was going to start with you before I mean, you've mentioned two now, Proudhon and Kropotkin. I've learned the names. I like them both. Actually, I picked up a Kropotkin book on vacation recently. It was the Anarchist, Anarcho-Communism, fantastic little screed that he wrote. But tell me, for somebody who was diving into the subject, looking to scratch the surface, who do you think the most important name to know is in the history of anarchist thought? Is it Proudhon? Would you say, like, start there, read this, and why? Make a case for maybe a couple of them, because I know they're different.
So I'm hesitant to say here's one person to read, because I mean, in a way, I mean, like all traditions, anarchism sort of develops through dialogue, and it develops through the attempt to sort of think about how ideas flesh out in practice and how practices speak to ideas. But I mean, if you wanted to for a contemporary reader, actually, I would start with a contemporary writer rather than go back to the history, unless you're really interested in the history. Because, I mean, the history can be, people write in different kind of registers, they write in different kind of languages, so that can be quite off-putting. But I think a good place to start, actually, may be someone like Colin Ward, Anarchy in Action. That's a nice sort of optimistic do-it-yourself book, been very influential, very accessible. And I think, or actually Colin Ward's very short introduction to anarchism, that's a really good starting point. Because that gives you something of the history, it gives you something of the people, it gives you something of the ideas and the principles of organizing, and it's again very accessible, very easy to get into.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's start, as I shared this kind of like outline before, to see if we could slog through the history and pick some sort of starting point to start the conversation. And 18th, 19th century thinkers, it seemed like there was a lot of them, but I kind of wanted to go back even a little earlier. So but not even with the anarchists, but I always record an intro to these talks, especially when I'm doing a new kind of topic for myself. So I actually just recorded it and wrote it, but I ended up kind of introducing the Thomas Hobbes theory of man. And
Okay.
yeah, and maybe, and this actually came up also with Sophie, but that we're kind of living in the shadow of Hobbes, all of us, and so many of the structures that we know that I think the anarchists were resisting or wanting to resist, came from. So I don't know how much you know about Hobbes in particular, but I would love to, if we could, start the conversation with Hobbes, give that like a time and a place, and then take it from there for when, if that makes sense, for when maybe the anarchist thought started to resist this Hobbesian theory of man that got into the water and started to really build things, for better or worse, really build things.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great. Good starting point.
So tell me what you know about Hobbes, sort of where and when he came from, and then take me, if that makes sense, like I said, and then take me to...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Hobbes is writing in the... he's writing in the English Civil War, so when the Roundheads and the... there's a battle basically about who's going to rule the Britain, or England as it was.
This is 1600s.
And is it going to be...
1600s.
Exactly. So we're talking about, this is the battle between the parliamentarians on the one hand and the monarchists on the other. And Hobbes's argument is really sort of designed to find a way of securing peace between two sides who are never going to agree. And so he tries to get us to imagine he creates a hypothetical situation which he calls the state of nature, and he sets the conditions of the state of nature. This is a pre-social condition, a pre-government society, or it's not a society, in fact, it's a condition of living. And he says, just imagine what it would be like if you didn't have any government at all. And he creates an image of human beings. We are isolated, so we are individuals we cannot cooperate with each other. We are plural in the sense that we don't agree about what's right or wrong. And although we might be people of faith, we cannot know God. God in principle is unknowable, therefore we cannot tap into any greater kind of supernatural sense of what is right and wrong. We are at liberty, we are completely free to secure anything that we can, anything that we desire, and we are driven by our desires and by our aversions to certain things. And we don't have the same desires, again, because we're different kinds of people. And because there is nothing to constrain us, and because we are different, and because we have no sense of right or wrong, basically what happens is that we come into conflict with each other. And there's no way of resolving this conflict except through violence, except through struggle. So Hobbes, having sort of created this picture of the state of nature, then says, well, what would you agree to, and what would motivate you to agree to a system of rule which resolved this horrible conflict between you? And he says the reason that you come to an agreement in the first place is because you're so fearful of your life in this condition. And the one thing that we do all share in common is a fear of violent death. And this fear of violent death leads us through our reason to conclude that actually we need to lay down our rights to everything, which is what we have in the state of nature, or make an agreement with a body Now, this could be a single person or a group of people, but it has to be a singular body. It is the sovereign. And he calls this Leviathan, and he says, you agree that as long as Leviathan maintains the peace between you, you agree to do anything that Leviathan commands. That is the will of the sovereign. And it doesn't matter what that will is, you have to obey. If you don't obey, then the sovereign can determine your fate.
Yeah.
And that's basically the origins of the state.
It was almost compelling the way that until the end, right? I mean, that's the interesting thing about the Hobbesian argument. I think astute listeners and viewers will hear the echoes of many modern thinkers and philosophers who are still basically putting out that argument. Okay, that was really good. 1600s. Is it fair to say at some point the anarchists basically, obviously people could hear that the anarchist would have a problem with that, especially the closing image of the Leviathan. Yeah. So who was sort of first in your view to maybe get a platform as an anarchist that would have started to maybe challenge this theory of man and then form the early idea I know anarchy, of course, is maybe a timeless idea, but the post-Hobbesian anarchism.
So, I mean, the person who explicitly takes Hobbes on and the concept of the state of nature that Hobbes gives us is Proudhon, and he does it in a chapter in a book that he writes towards the end of his life in 1861 called War and Peace.
Yeah.
And basically, his argument is that the problem with Hobbes is that he's constructed his hypothetical scenario, this state of nature, is completely unrealistic. If you want to know, Proudhon tells us about how people behave, then why don't you just look at how they behave? And actually what you'll find is that in real societies across the world, people do not actually struggle with each other because of they have competing rights or desires. Actually, what happens is that people interact with each other, they invent social rules, they have norms, they have moral codes, they have religion.
Yeah.
And these things bring them together, not necessarily without conflict, but actually providing the basis of a conversation about what is the right way of living. And if you let people organize themselves and discuss with each other this question about how they should live and what's right and what's wrong, you'll find that their norms and their practices and their traditions change over time.
Yeah.
And what the anarchist wants to do is to find a way to keep that kind of texture of social interaction open by maintaining self-government and by sort of encouraging people to think about the values and the institutions, the underpinning institutions, if you like, that make that system work. Mm-hmm. And the argument that the anarchist comes up with is basically, you're going to be able to keep those practices of self-government alive if you minimize the inequalities between people, such that you don't create the jealousies and the rivalries and the competition for resources that creates conflict between us. And if you don't entrench authority such that everybody is able to participate to the decision-making processes of the unit, it's pretty much common sense. Yeah. But what their critique is that if you start from the wrong place, which is the idea that we live atomized lives and that we are necessarily in competition with each other, if you start with a false premise, you're bound to get a faulty answer. And the faulty answer is sovereignty and government.
Can you tell me more about Proudhon, like the man in his life? Because I'm curious about sort of where to put him in history and sort of the world that he was looking at and why he would maybe see a problem with it or a lack of freedom. Just give me his life a little bit. Yeah.
So Proudhon is a sort of second generation, I guess, socialist. So socialism starts or is coined somewhere between the 1820s and 1840s, and it tends to be associated with people like Robert Owen, who's the advocate of cooperation, and Charles Fourier, who's sometimes classed as a utopian socialist. Well, they're both classed as utopian socialists. and between them, they actually inspire, a mass movement in Europe, particularly in Britain and in France. But their influence extends also to America. And Proudhon is the generation later. So Proudhon's date, he's born in 1809. He dies in 1865. He's born in Besançon, which is in the east of France, and it's a small town. It's not far from Dijon. He's self-educated. He's a printer, so he absorbs a huge amount of literature through his work as a printer. And he wins a competition to write this tract in 1840, which is called "What is Property?" And he asks this question in "What is Property?" If I was to ask the question, "What is property?" and there's an extended sort of answer to this, but the nub of it is property is theft, and this is the book that establishes Proudhon as this leading figure in socialist thinking in Europe, and he attracts a huge audience in France. I mean, France is going through. I mean, there's a whole series of France is sort of unstable, really, post-revolution from the 1892, really. And there are lots of sort of discontents, and there's a growing workers' movement, artisan workers' movement, particularly in Paris. And in 1848, which is the year of revolutions in Europe, Proudhon runs something like 4 papers, I think, in the course of 1848 to 49. These are directed towards a working class readership, and he becomes the leading socialist figure in Europe. And he's a prolific writer, and he writes about everything, really. So he writes about a theory of revolution, theories of organization. He writes about federalism. He writes critiques of everybody. He generates a huge amount of criticism, directed against him. And one of the things that he makes his own, which becomes one of the underpinnings, I suppose, of the anarchist movement, is this idea that actually the transition, the revolutionary transition from autocracy, the abolition of the monarchy, towards constitutionalism, is not as great as we should, as is presented to us. That actually what's happened is not that we've, in having constitutional government, is not that we've liberated ourselves. Actually, what we've done is we've transformed the systems of government, and we haven't really freed ourselves. What we've done is created new systems of oppression by taking over the existing machinery of government. And what we have to do is to anarchize rather than constitutionalize.
That's great. I realized that what you just said reminded me of this great line that a taxi driver gave to me. It was my wife and I were in Nepal, who had fairly recently shifted from a monarchy to a constitutionalism, and they have something like 700 representatives now or something, and they had this. If anyone knows the story of Nepal, there was like a machine gun murder of the royal family, this crazy thing that happened that sort of ended it in this very violent way with one of the sons or something. But this taxi driver maybe he's a budding anarchist, because we were asking him about that transition, and he said, yeah, we used to have one king, now we have 700. and it was kind of a good sense of Proudhon in there. But so back to the history thing, I realized that the property is theft, which has become a great lasting kind of fortune cookie, bumper sticker for a lot of movements, including socialism. I realize there's another conversation, and then historically, I think it spans already what we talked about. So I kind of already ruined my chronological attempt. But can you tell me generally about the Enclosure movement? That I think, is he responding to that there? The Enclosure movements of it's hard for us to imagine now land that is open, common, without owner, and sort of used and shared mutually. But this was completely normal and common for centuries, millennia, I suppose. But even under the feudal system with kings, there was systems like this. But this all ended. Am I getting this time period right? Was it like 1500s to like 1800s, the movements of Enclosure, maybe in England?
So yes. Yeah. So what happens in the post-French Revolution, in France, is that you have these. The land ownership system is based on huge estates, as it is in significant parts of Europe. So you have a system where the monarch is basically sort of keeping the structure of the structure of elite society happy by giving them grants of land. Mm-hmm. And those landowners then, own not only the land, but all of the workers that work the land. And what happens in France after the revolution is this, the estates are kind of abandoned or abolished. And the ownership then falls to those who have the money. Mm-hmm. It doesn't fall to the people who work it. So enclosures for me sort of is actually a process whereby it's the initial kind of claim to title of common lands that have been worked for generations by people who live on those lands. And who can't prove any title because there is no legal title because it's common land. That's the whole point about it. And of course, as soon as you have the introductions of law and the ideas of property, and someone can say, well, I can buy this land and create title, then you're removing that land from common ownership. And what happens after the French Revolution is something similar to that. But this is sort of law has already been established. You have systems of law. So what's happening is just purchase. Mm-hmm. But because it has the same effect in the sense that you have mass dispossession of the rural workforces who actually, would have wanted perhaps to have called the land their own because they were the people who worked it. But the bourgeoisie then take over the title. So he's certainly responding to this movement of dispossession. Yeah. Which leaves people at the beck and call of those who will employ them, and which also, I suppose, from Proudhon's point of view, the idea of having an exclusive right to property is in principle wrong-headed because it means it's an idea that enables the property owners to do anything they like with that land, including just to waste it. They don't have to, they can just call it their own. They can keep everybody else off it, but they can poison it. They can do nothing with it. They can just prevent other people from making productive use of it. And it generates even more kinds of inequalities, but it's completely irrational to have some people who have an exclusive title to something that they can't actually make productive use of. And he's definitely responding to this complaint that people have not only been thrown off the land, but the costs of that, the long-term costs of that in terms of the inequalities it generates and the irrationalities of the systems of production that it supports these are deeply felt. And he speaks to all of these concerns.
Yeah, I think people could feel that just about everywhere you walk in any city, knowing that, half the apartments are laying dormant and empty because some rich person owns 4 of them, and then there's a homeless guy on the street. I always think if some alien came down and just saw the situation, they would find it absurd and immoral. And if we tried to explain it as like, oh, we have this system of property and there's a whole they would just be like, well, it's clearly not working because look at your streets.
That's right.
Yeah, it seems
and actually in cities, it's often very unclear as to who owns the land. So,
right.
In London, a lot of the land is owned by corporations. Yeah. And you only find out about these things when you try and organize something on that land. And then you find that it's, actually it's owned by somebody else. Vast tracts of land.
Yeah. Well, let's keep slogging through the history. So Proudhon's a good place to start. But there was a lot of other anarchists at the same time that I sort of had pegged there who were overlap with his dates and years. Where do you think would it make sense to go next? Who might add more to the conversation? Kropotkin was doing his thing. We have Karl Marx waiting in the wings doing his thing. Where do you think to add to the conversation makes sense to tell this story?
So I suppose, Proudhon, actually one of the people who Proudhon is involved with and I think has a profound influence on is Leo Tolstoy, who also happens to write a book called War and Peace. Tolstoy, I think, learns an awful lot from Proudhon. So, and Proudhon's ideas, they are sort of taken up, into Russia, across the world, and he has a lasting influence in the organization which is set up in 1864, which is called the International Working Man's Association. Where his followers are then called Federalists, And I suppose one of the sort of the one of the legacies of Proudhon is that his influence is felt negatively by Marx, who's also a presence in the International. And so the roots of the dispute between these two socialist currents, the anarchists on the one hand and the Marxists on the other, they're seeded really by Proudhon. So in that sense, I mean, the answer to your question, I mean, the person, you know, if we're going to think about individuals in these movements, the person who really sort of becomes central to the development of anarchism, anarchist socialism in the 19th century after Proudhon is Mikhail Bakunin.
Yeah, let's go to him. Yeah.
Who defends Proudhon in many ways and takes the fight, if you like, against Marx in the International.
Yeah, let's lay that out then. Let's do. I mean, what did Marx disagree with there? Marx's vision, and then Mikhail's defense and split. Because I think now the word socialism, it's like, it's hard to track in history. One really hard, just for my audience, one difficult thing in this conversation is so many of these words and titles are like, they hit the ear so differently now to a listener in 2025, including libertarianism. I mean, I'm American, so that one hits my ear in a very different way than most Europeans. Yeah. And then socialism has its own thing, and communism. So it gets just really muddy to follow.
Yeah, it does get muddy.
Yeah.
So socialism is the umbrella term.
Okay.
In the 19th century. So the people socialism is pretty much the umbrella term, and that's the term that under which this, you know, vast array of movements and individuals organize around. And the split within socialism is between, on the one hand, the followers of Marx. I mean, you know, Marx becomes very prominent in European socialism and subsequently American socialism too, around about the time of 1870, 1871, which is the period of the Paris Commune. Mm-hmm. And at this point, Marx has an executive role in the International, and he becomes the sort of its leading voice, if you like. He becomes its official voice. And because the Commune is such a shocking event to, you know, middle class publics, he becomes the Red Doctor. He becomes the kind of the leading kind of threat, if you like, socialist threat that people have heard of. The dispute with Bakunin, I mean, that has deep roots, but it comes, I mean, it really sort of comes to a crisis in 1871 to 72, at the point at which the Commune is crushed by force. And the disagreement turns on, I suppose, the debates about how socialists should organize on the back of the experience of the Commune. And there are two sort of strands to the argument. One is a policy disagreement. So Bakunin and Marx disagree about the direction that the International should take. And Marx's view is that the International should become a much more centralized body, a homogenous body with a definite program, which then all its members, all its Socialist Party members, and these would be groups that are organizing in different countries across the world, they would all subscribe to the program. Mm-hmm. And Bakunin thinks that this is a mistake, just strategically, because you've got very different conditions in different parts of the world. So, you know, workers in Germany don't face the same kind of situations as workers in Cuba. So to have a kind of collective or a single program is problematic. But in principle, he also disagrees because he thinks that workers should be organized from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So actually policy should be something that emerges through dialogue of the constituent units rather than being designed by an executive group. And then there's a sort of a theoretical disagreement that feeds into this, which is about the way that socialism should be conceptualized. And Marx's view is that socialism is the condition that is created after the destruction or after the self-destruction of capitalism. Hmm. And so socialism is the kind of it requires industrialization. It's based on quite a narrow view of class. It's based on urbanization, and it sets up a kind of an image of a highly kind of developed industrialized society, which will be collectivized through the existing infrastructure of the state. And Bakunin thinks that this is just an unappealing idea. And he, like Proudhon, is a federalist. So he is someone who thinks that when we think about socialism, we have to think about the systems which enable us to govern ourselves in the smallest possible units, to enable us to participate as equals, and, as I say, keep the kind of the texture of government open rather than concentrate power in anybody's hands. Bakunin, coming from a Russian context also, is very alert, as Proudhon had been, to the fact that the majority of workers in the 19th century were not urban workers or industrial workers, they were rural workers. And he certainly didn't like the idea that, progress, in inverted commas, could only be defined in terms of the industrialization of agriculture or industrialization full stop. He actually thought that, what we should be doing is thinking about, how people are living on the ground and how we can, through helping federal organization, empower groups of people to improve their economic conditions without sacrificing their ways of life.
Can you go back to tell me, because I'm ignorant about a lot of this stuff, the Paris Commune?
Right, sorry.
Yeah. What was that, and why did it get crushed on the back? Yeah,
right.
I'm going to be staggering through the history as you go forward. I'm going to pull you back to tell me something.
No. Very good question. I should have explained. So the Paris Commune it takes place. It's an event, and it takes place at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So in the late 19th century, or from the mid-19th, I suppose, from the 1860s. The Chancellor of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, is hatching a plan basically to unify Germany, and he fights a series of wars which enable Prussia to enlarge itself and establish the borders of the modern German state. And the last of these wars is fought with France, and it results in a dramatic French defeat, the fall of the Emperor Louis Napoleon, and the establishment of the Third Republic in France. And as part of this, of the negotiation of the defeat, Bismarck demands of the new French government, the provisional government, that the guns of Paris, they've got big guns in Paris, that these are surrendered. And this provisional government agrees and tries to take the guns out of Paris. And the workers in Paris disagree and say, you're not taking our guns. And they declare themselves autonomous. And this is the Commune. This event is called the Commune, and they set up barricades in Paris. They set up their own system of government. It's in many ways a fantastic experiment. It's neither anarchist nor Marxist. It's a workers' democracy, if you like. And eventually, it's what happens is that the provisional Republican government use force against the Commune. They destroy the Commune. They deploy the army against the National Guard against the Commune, or the army against the Commune. And there's a bloody week in May of 1871. In which an estimated 20,000, conservative estimate, 20,000 people are slaughtered. The higher figure that's given by some of the anarchists who were involved is up to 100,000, but no one really knows. But it's a big dramatic event, and it represents, on the one hand, the crushing of socialism, of European socialism. It's a huge setback, but on the other hand, it becomes a kind of a focal point for radical Republican and socialist organizing. The memory of the Commune is burnt in the hearts of the people of Paris who were taking part in it, but also it becomes a kind of like an example, if you like, of the violence of republicanism, and actually the a reminder that you cannot trust a constitutional government to govern in the name of the people. It will take the people's name and actually use power against them.
Yeah, very good. So yeah, that's great, because I think as I keep traversing here, I'm gonna try to keep track of kind of the history of thought. Yeah, because we're going to be in a lot of places, but the history of thought, the thread, and it won't be a continuous thread, but a thought since starting with Hobbes and going to Proudhon, like the thought of, I know anarchy is not this positive vision. It's famously playful and anti a lot of things, but famously doesn't want to tell anyone what it is or how to set anything up. But I want to try to keep a history of a thought that brings us up to maybe to today. And then there's these pockets where these thoughts kind of manifest into actual experiments on the ground, like the Paris Commune. So to try to keep track of like what we're fashioning them in the name of or as. Obviously we'll get to maybe what happened with Marx and whatever. But so I think maybe from there, so you had Bakunin, if I'm getting it right, sort of, I'm not even sure what to think about Marx, to be honest, with this split, because there's so much noise about Marx, and someone like Chomsky writes about him negatively, and then Erich Fromm, one of my favorite thinkers, is a big defender of Marx and wants to say he was very misunderstood. I have it up here, I haven't read it yet, the new translation that's like this thick, and I think there's like 4 of them coming out from the original German that might shed some more light on him. I don't know what to think about Marx, but if I'm getting it right from your sort of split there, it was like Marx put forward maybe he disagreed with Hobbes theoretically. I'm not sure. You could correct me if I'm wrong. But he just thought that there was this kind of natural transition of governments and periods, and centralized socialism would one day give way to communism as some ultimate. I don't know if that story about him is correct, but then there was people like Bakunin or maybe Kropotkin who say, no, this is all nonsense. You can't go through these transitionary periods of different forms of power. You just have to abolish the state right away. And is that right? Is that kind of a way to think of their split?
So, yeah, I mean, Marx is he's a complex thinker, and and I guess there's an awful lot one can learn from reading Marx. I'm less convinced about Marx as a socialist leader, and I think that's where the kind of some of the issues arise, if you like, with the anarchists. So and certainly because Marx dies in 1883, is it? And after that, because the legacy is taken over by Engels, so there's a big debate about how far Engels is a sort of a faithful interpreter of Marx. But what happens in the development of Marxism, which takes the name confusingly up to 1917 of social democracy. So social democracy is Marxism in Europe until Lenin in 1917 sort of rebrands it all. But social democracy becomes associated with the idea that because we can be confident in the analysis, the scientific analysis that Marx gives us of the development of capitalism and its inevitable collapse, that's the kind of starting point, if you like. Because we can be confident of that, we can organize ourselves accordingly in order to make sure that the working class are in the best possible position to take over the reins of power when the crisis of capitalism comes.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then there are sort of ramifications of this sort of thinking, which are, in order to make sure that the working class are not going to be subject to the kind of violence that we saw in the Commune, actually what we ought to be doing is working within the law and within the institutions of government in order to ultimately destroy them.
Right.
Because we don't want to attract, it's, states that, we can see what bourgeois governments do to workers. They fire guns at them. So what we need to do to protect the workers' organisations in the meantime is ensure that they have the best possible legal protections for their activity. So we should work through political parties. We should work in electoral politics. And, because we know that eventually this system is going to collapse. And the anarchists, one, don't buy into the story of the inevitable collapse of capitalism. They don't like the idea that capitalism is the only, they have a different understanding of the relationship between capitalism and the state. They don't think that class, as in the relationship between those who own the means of production and those who don't have any ownership of the means of production, is the only system, is the only source of oppression.
Right.
So there are other sources of oppression, like sexism, like patriarchy. They talk in terms of kind of a system, or what we would now call a system of oppression. They talk about enslavement and the way that people are enslaved to these joint systems of statism and government, statism and capitalism, or trade, commerce.
Yeah. So go ahead.
So I think there's some truth, if you like, in the antagonism between social democrats and anarchists in the 19th and early 20th century. I don't think that exhausts what Marxism is, and certainly I also like Erich Fromm. So there's a vast amount of writers and movements that work within these orbits, but the main lines, the main currents of socialism in this period of time are pretty antagonistically drawn because of this division over political action versus direct action.
Okay, fair. So then I don't know if Kropotkin and his kind of ideas are smart to go to here, because it seems like that critique, which has a little bit more of, I don't know how you would, like I told you, I read this one little manifesto and it was kind of great. It's more of a workers' creed, a historical text. I don't know if that, it seems like that is taking a much more, to me now, a much more attractive run at the problem. But maybe a little closer to what I came into these conversations thinking anarchy was. Is his vision of things.
Yeah, so Kropotkin is a sort of comes the generation after Bakunin. He's also a Russian, or by birth. He becomes a revolutionary, or he becomes in Russian terms, an anti-autocrat revolutionary. Before he comes to Europe, he becomes an anarchist when he first visits Europe. But he's imprisoned in Russia and then he escapes, and he spends most of his life in exile in Britain, and later goes back to Russia in 1917.
Was he in prison for his ideas and his writing? It was...
Yeah. He's in prison because he joins a revolutionary movement which is called the Tchaikovsky Circle, which is then attempting to, and he is actually trying to propagate anarchist ideas through the Tchaikovsky Circle. But he's denounced and he's imprisoned for that. He's one of the people who is involved in persuading the rump of the anarchist socialist movement. After the split of the International, after the anarchists part company with the Marxists, he's instrumental, not by himself, but he is one of the leaders or one of the pioneers who persuade anarchists to become communist. Yeah. And he uses the term communist. So this is, at this point, communist is not associated with Marxism as such. So the anarchists begin to call themselves, they start off calling themselves anti-authoritarian, and with Kropotkin's generation, they start to call themselves anarchist communists. Yeah. And the reason they call themselves communists, it comes back to this idea of property and how you maintain open systems of self-government. And Kropotkin's argument is that the only way, in the end, that you can secure yourself or guard society against the problem of accumulation and against the problem of exclusive ownership is to abandon ownership completely. Yeah. So no one owns anything, and that includes the state. So you can't just give property, collectivize it and say now the state owns it, because that just means that you've got a group who control the levers of power, deciding what's going to happen to all this property and who's going to work it and how they do it and all the rest of it. Kropotkin wants to just get rid of the idea of any kind of ownership at all, so that groups can decide themselves how they're going to use resource collectively for the general good. without then the fear that any subset of that group can claim anything as their own and use that as a basis for the development of new systems of power.
Can you explain that a little more? I mean, and he also, I think, was he the one who put out this sort of notion of mutual aid as a basis for society?
He's also associated with the idea of mutual aid, which again is a term that's developed by a number of writers at the same time. But one of the things that Kropotkin wants to think about is, so he starts off with he is also an anti-Hobbesian. So he starts off with the idea that societies are self-governing and we're complex. Okay, so if you leave us to our own devices, you'll find that there are different kinds of pressures that are active on us. One is a pressure to compete. So we are, in some senses, rivals to each other. But that's not the only social pressure we feel. We're also, no individual can, or generally speaking, individuals do not flourish well by themselves. Mm-hmm. Their well-being is only secured through their cooperation with others.
Yeah.
So, you simply can't feed yourself, clothe yourself, flourish as an individual unless you do it in company. So Kropotkin says we're cooperative beings and we're kind of competitive beings at the same time. So if you think that we have both of these drivers or both of these pressures are active on us, then the question is, well, how do you encourage the cooperation and make the competition fruitful? And that's a question of organization. That's a question of environmental condition. And his argument is, well, if you want people to cooperate, you have to take the things that the temptations, if you like, or the mechanisms that are likely to make their competition aggressive. You have to remove those, and property is one of those things.
Yeah. So that's one of those ideas that non-anarchists probably scoff at and say it's ridiculous and unworkable. What do you mean, no private property? This vinyl record that I own behind me right now that I bought at a store, it's mine, right? If somebody comes in to this apartment and takes it, can they just take it? Is it theirs now? Does it belong to anyone? Then how would he respond to that? And then as I'm trying to do here also with tell me if there are interesting manifestations of maybe a Kropotkin-esque ideas that have popped up in the world throughout time, even of course in prehistory. It doesn't need to just be after him and because of him, but these things really do show up in the world. They don't sound as ridiculous as it does to a modern capitalist ear.
Yeah. Okay. So, we all have things. We all have things that we're sentimentally attached to that we would like to call our own.
Yeah.
And Proudhon makes the same argument. There's no harm in having property in use. Yeah. Things that you use, things that you love, things that you are attached to. The argument is usually framed in terms of, can I call my toothbrush my own, or do I have to, give this up to the community? No, you can call your toothbrush your own. You can call your vinyls your own. My books are my own.
Yeah.
What we mean about property, though, the dangers of property and the dangers of accumulation are, well, if I call this book my own for now, does that mean that, when I'm gone, my descendants can take my property and sell it for profit?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these things could be mine for now, but when I'm not using them, they can be anybody's. The property is the exclusive right in perpetuity to the thing in order to make profit from it. And that's what they want. That's what Kropotkin wants to eradicate.
Yeah.
So if you're given a plate by Picasso, sure, hang it on the wall, use it, love it, but you can't then claim the right of transfer,
right,
or your descendants, because this was yours in perpetuity.
Yeah.
This can go. This does not belong to anybody in the end.
Yeah.
It's just your using.
And do you know, like I said, of cultures or communes or people who've, I mean, it seems like that one actually is more common than people think. Societies that really didn't, I think there's a lot of maybe Native American communities that really didn't have the vocabulary of private property at all, or ownership.
But I think, it's hard to get your head around. But then I think, you can't just take one institution and
Yeah.
say, so let's think about this differently. We would have to think about lots of things differently. We'd have to think about production differently.
Yeah.
We'd have to think about our consumption differently. And that's what Kropotkin wants us to do. That if we think about not owning things in order to benefit personally from their accumulation, then actually, maybe we have fewer things, but more things we really love.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we, the whole point of this is that in the end, everything we have is on some level shared.
Yeah.
It's, so, nobody is responsible. No one individual is responsible for any particular thing.
Yeah.
Everyone's been educated by somebody else. Everyone's skills are cultivated by other people. Everybody's talents are nurtured by a social environment. We have to think of our whole social connection as something that is fundamental to the things that we then call, for now, our own.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. So let's try to trace these thoughts then and see what's happening in sort of the 19th and early 20th century. I guess we're pre-World War One. What was kind of happening there? And I don't think we've touched on, and maybe I just don't know their dates very well yet, we haven't touched on the interesting anarchist thought and energy happening in America at this time, which maybe Indeed. Starts to take some hold there in the late 1800s. Is that right?
Yeah. So the early 1880s, there's I suppose before that, there's an American anarchist movement, which is sometimes traced back to Josiah Warren, who's a contemporary of Proudhon. That not that they know each other, but Warren is the sort of has a profound influence on anarchists in America, who eventually, some of whom call themselves individualists, who look at the revolutionary settlement and the Constitution, and think that actually what's happened is that the systems of government that have been set up on the back of that revolution are actually betraying the Constitution, because they're initiating all kinds of practices and rules and property rights and all the rest of it, which are actually eroding the power of individuals to self-govern. And for them, the American Revolution is all about self-government and freedom from tyranny. And what they see in America after the revolution is actually the establishment of new systems of tyranny. So there is that tradition within America. And that goes through people like Lysander Spooner, and eventually to Benjamin Tucker, who becomes the sort of the leading figure in this so-called individualist American tradition. But then there's another sort of tradition which is, I suppose, galvanized by the waves of immigration in the 1880s. So you've got groups of German workers, Italian workers, Jewish workers coming from East and Central Europe, and often settling in the big cities, and organizing. Actually just through labor organizing. And some of these people are anarchists. The ideas that after the breakup of the International in Europe, this sort of has ramifications or echoes in America. And so you have the establishment of anarchist groups, particularly in Chicago. And they're instrumental in labor organizing, in campaigns for the 8-hour day, in campaigns for better conditions, working conditions. So, these are not people who are setting up unions as such, but they're people who are getting involved in labor activism as anarchists in order to promote anarchist ideas with those working groups.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Maybe as an American, I just have a bias, but as I've been digesting some more of the anarchist arguments, and I've been wondering if the American Constitution in some ways had, I don't know if you call it an anarchist document, maybe some people thought it was one, but it had certainly anarchist energy in it to a degree, and including I don't know if it was Thomas Jefferson or whatever, the hopeful idea of building in the, like, this is not permanent, break this down every few years you need, or every whatever, so many years you need a revolution.
That's right. So so the idea of division, the idea of secession, absolutely opposition to tyranny. I mean, these are ideas that are picked up actually by American or anarchists who are active in America. And one of the newspapers that's produced in Chicago, called The Alarm, which reproduces this sort of manifesto. It's called the Pittsburgh Manifesto. I mean, it actually quotes Jefferson. So they use the language of revolution in order to show that, you know, what they're supporting is not a million miles from a classic kind of Republican resistance to oppression. What they're saying is that the revolution hasn't been pushed through yet. So they're quite, you know, in a sense, I mean, they know that they're being outlawed, and they know that they're facing, you know, significant force against them. But in some sense, there's a sort of like a surprise that the divisions between anarchism and civilized politics, you know, acceptable politics, are drawn so fiercely, because from their point of view, they're not arguing anything that's fundamentally different. They're picking up on a political culture that's deeply rooted in America.
Where a lot of those early, sorry to stay with America, I'm showing my bias, but where a lot of those early supposed American anarchists, I would suspect if they had these anarchist ideals that were sort of anti-power consolidation or hierarchy in general, would have had a major problem with something like slavery as well in America.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah, and that, yeah.
And so, I mean, and a lot of the language of enslavement comes from, you know, the involvement that anarchists have in abolitionist movements. And some of them are coming. I mean, you know, Lucy Parsons, who's one of the sort of the leading activists in Chicago, it was born into slavery. So there's an acute awareness of I mean, that sort of changes this idea of, or adds another layer, if you like, to this idea of transformation, that you haven't actually got rid of autocracy or tyranny. You've just changed its spots. And similarly, I mean, the argument is made about the abolition of slavery. You haven't actually abolished slavery. What you've done is you've transformed it. So, I mean, Albert Parsons, who's put on trial in 1886 for being involved in labour activism, basically, says this on the stand. He says, you know, in the old days, it used to be the master who chose the slave, and today it's the slave who's compelled to choose the master. And if the slave can't find a master, then the slave will starve. So there are differences, of course, between chattel slavery and wage slavery, but actually the relationship in terms of the domination of the property owner, employer, the boss, and the worker is comparable.
Amazing. Yeah. Am I getting the dates right for someone like Emma Goldman, who would also be in this period? Is that
so? Emma Goldman, she comes to America she's radicalized actually by what happens in Chicago. So she comes, can't remember exactly when she arrives in America. It's the 1880s. So she's she's sort of part of this this wave. I mean, she's a great example actually of someone who comes from Eastern Europe and autocracy, thinking that she's going to arrive in the land of milk and honey, thinking of America as this land of the free, this land of liberation. And she settles, eventually she goes to New York, and she becomes part of the community, the Jewish communities there, who are struggling for subsistence, and discovers that actually, you know, she's been living under an illusion. And America is not the land of the free at all. And she gets involved in free speech campaigns. She gets involved in labor activism. And eventually, I mean, she's also she's very taken with the campaigns that she discovers that are already active when she arrives in America, campaigns which are about women's rights in particular. So campaigns to recognize, for example, rape in marriage, campaigns to provide information about birth control, all of which are treated as obscenity at the time, and people are being locked up for even talking about this. And later on, as Europe goes to war in 1914, she gets very involved in anti-conscription campaigns as an anti-militarist. So someone who doesn't want America to join in with the war. And eventually, of course, she's deported as a result of that activity in 1919.
Amazing. Let's stay around World War One, but I think, like I said, that's the end of part one. Please do find part two, where we continue the conversation and take it through World War One and into the Russian Revolution and World War Two and onward to the punk movement and all kinds of good stuff all the way up until today. So go find part two.